Hello again, Netrunner fans, Willingdon here, and I am back for the Underway. This is the fourth data pack in the Sand cycle. As has been the custom for this cycle, I'm going to be starting with the runner cards in this video. We'll look at the corp cards in part 2. We're going to kick things off with a new icebreaker for Anarch. This is Faust. It is 3 to install, 1 MU, 2 strength. It's an AI, and it's 2 influence. Trash a card from your grip, break ice subroutine. And then it has trash a card from your grip plus 2 strength. This thing's got quite a bit going for it. It's got really good stats, being only 3 to install, it's only 1 MU, it starts with 2 strength, only 2 influence. All of those things are good. The trashing a card from your grip, I really like that. I don't know how well it's going to work out, but I think it's really cool that there's this non-credit way to power your icebreaker, and I feel like this is particularly Anarch, because you're trashing cards, you're getting rid of cards, you're losing stuff you have. Seems very Anarch to me. As it is, I think that this is the type of thing that's probably only going to see play in a few Anarch decks, but I'm pretty excited to try it in those. I think Noise is pretty easily the one that I want to try it in the first. Noise has usually played like Crypsis or Darwin or some of the less good icebreakers, especially the AI icebreakers, because he usually doesn't have enough deck slots to play a quote-unquote real rig. So I think in general, this is the type of thing that he would be more inclined to play just because it's an AI breaker. But I also think the trashing a card from your grip thing works out pretty well for him, especially if you're playing the wild side adjusted chronotype engine. I'm really inclined to try this in Noise, especially with wild side adjusted chronotype, because you'd play so many redundant cards in that deck anyway. Your superfluous copies of Aesop's, wild side, chronotype, sometimes things like Cyber Feeder that you don't need extra copies of. You're usually pretty okay with discarding second copies of Jin and stuff like that. There's just a lot of cards that you're playing redundant copies of so that you draw them early enough, and this is the type of card that's going to interact really well with that. So I see this maybe working its way into Noise. I think he's already a pretty good choice in the current metagame, and I'm really anxious to try this guy out in that deck. Next up we have Street Peddler. This is an Anarch resource. It's 0 to play. It's 1 influence. It's a connection and it's CD. We haven't seen that for a little bit. When you install Street Peddler, host the top 3 cards of your stack face down on Street Peddler. And you can look at those cards at any time. Thanks. Trash Street Peddler, install 1 hosted card, lowering its install cost by 1. Well, this is certainly more of a card access effect than it is an economy tool. I don't think you're really going to care that much about lowering the install cost by 1, especially since you're potentially losing 2 other cards that could have done something. Obviously, with this card, you're going to need to play things that you can install. So that's a big point with this thing. If you're playing a ton of events, you're not really going to want something like this. It's a connection, which is kind of cool, but I don't really see you ever wanting to tutor this. This seems like the type of thing to me that you're going to play either 3 of or 0 of. You're going to want the ability to kind of filter and find the programs that you're looking for. I could maybe see something like Noise wanting this, since you already play a ton of programs. But I think that this is going to shine the most with the next card that we're going to talk about. So I'll come back to that once we've looked at him. The next card is a new criminal ID. This is Armand Geist Walker, Tech Lord. He's got 1 link, he's 4515, he's a Gmod. Whenever you use a trash ability, draw a card. Even if this guy doesn't work out and end up being good, this is exactly the sort of design I like to see with IDs. There are quite a few trash abilities on good cards that we play commonly, like SMC and Clone Chip and Same Old Thing and stuff like that. But realistically, you're going to have to play some kind of bad trash cards, or cards that you wouldn't normally play if you're really going to want to make this deck work out. And I really, really like the idea of having IDs that encourage you to play kind of more fringe aspects of the card pool, fringe cards that you wouldn't play out of that context. I want to quickly point out that this is whenever you use a trash ability, meaning that it's not just the first time. I think a lot of these abilities we're used to seeing the first time. This is going to work every single time you use a trash ability, so that you're going to be incentivized at least somewhat to pack your deck full of cards that have some kind of trash ability. Without a doubt, this guy has the most potential of any card in Netrunner in terms of quantity of cards that you can draw. If Netrunner DB is to be believed, there are 32 cards, including some that are later in this pack, that have some sort of trash effect. As I mentioned earlier, some of them are already cards that we play extensively, especially Clone Chip and Same Old Thing. Those cards seem like they're just such massive mainstays that it's not really going to be much of a challenge to include those. But also I think the Street Peddler that we just looked at is an auto-include for this dude, especially since I think that the way you're going to want to do the Breaker Suite with him is playing these bad Cloud Breakers. Now, I've been pretty down on these Cloud Breakers in my last couple reviews, but I did say that I thought that someday they would make a little bit more sense. I think this guy is definitely the way that these are going to make sense. He already has a link, so it's going to be easier to meet that cloud requirement, and we're going to see a card in just a minute that's going to make it easy as well. So we've already got the tools to meet the cloud requirements. We're going to be able to play these Cloud Breakers. They're cheap to install. We're going to be able to use them and draw more cards, which is potentially going to be more of the Cloud Breakers. I really think that this card has some serious potential in as a deck that can seriously burn through your deck. You're just going to draw so many cards. You're going to be constantly drawing. You're not going to have to click to draw a lot because his ID ability is going to be triggering all the time if you build the deck correctly. There's going to be some cards that we're going to talk about later in this pack that are going to be cards that I think you would absolutely consider for this deck. And I think that this guy is kind of the theme of the pack, since we're going to see him and then also quite a few cards that work with him. The real power of this ID is that there's lots of clickless draw. You're going to have cards that you can trash that don't require a click to trash them, and you're going to be able to draw cards. That effect is always going to be powerful, but I think the fact that this guy could draw so many cards and you can play such a large number of trash effects in your deck, this is definitely something that I think we need to look out for. I really like the design of this. It seems obvious to me how to go about building a deck, and it's going to use a lot of cards that you wouldn't really consider using otherwise. That's really what I like to see in ID design, both straightforward ways to build a deck, and also a deck that can capitalize on cards that we don't normally play. This is a great design, and I hope that it reinvigorates some interest in Criminal. I feel like Criminal has kind of went to the wayside lately, and this pack's got a lot of cool things going on, both with him and some of the other cards we're going to see. The next card in the pack is a new double event for Criminal. It's called Driveby. It's 0 to play, 2 influence, costs an extra click, that's the double part. Expose 1 card installed in a remote server. Trash that card at no cost if it's an asset or an upgrade. This is straightforwardly the best expose effect that's ever been printed. And this is more on the power level of what expose effects should be capable of. I think throughout Netrunner, the primary effect of certain cards has been exposing, whereas exposing I think should be more of a secondary effect. With this card, it's pretty clear to me that the primary effect is that you get to, for free, trash an asset or upgrade. That's going to be insanely good against a lot of different cards that already see a lot of play. It's pretty obvious, like Caprice, Ash, stuff like that. If your opponent hasn't res them, you're going to be able to expose them and trash them. Now that's a huge caveat. A lot of people online have been talking about how this is like the Caprice killer and the Ash Killer, and it's just going to completely destroy RP. And I don't buy that for a second. In general, this is just going to force RP players to res that type of upgrade earlier than they normally would. Keep in mind that you can only use expose effects against unresed cards. So if your opponent has a Caprice or an Ash resed, like if they just play it and then immediately res it on their turn, you're not going to be able to use Driveby against that. So I think as long as RP players are smart, this isn't really going to be an effective tool against Ash or Caprice. It does make them to play somewhat suboptimally. They're going to have to spend money when they wouldn't want to and things like that. It's going to make it harder to place Ash or Caprice in a server before you're ready to score and things like that. So there is certainly an impact of this card on Ash and Caprice, but that's really not where I see this card shining. It's also important to point out that this only works on remotes, so it's not going to help us deal with high trash cost effects that are commonly on the central servers, especially things like Chrysium Grid. I don't really see that this isn't going to help us with that because very, very rarely are you going to play that type of card on your remote server. This card's going to shine against effects that the corp doesn't want to res immediately. The easiest example I can think of is Sansan City Grid. For the most part, the way people play with City Grid is they put it down in a remote and it sits there for a long time, 2 or 3 turns at least, and then eventually once they've got the Astro thing ready to go, they res the City Grid and fire it. This is going to be ideal against that type of thing. You might have already ran the Sansan and you know it's there, so you can just fire this and it kills it for free. That's probably going to be worth it in some situations. This is also going to be really good against like PE, or things that have nasty traps that you're worried about running into. This is really hot against their Mushin Notion play, right? They play some card down with Mushin Notion and you drive by it. You don't really care what it is, and if it's an agenda, you can probably just get into the server. You got inside job, you're criminal. This card's going to be a nice weapon in the criminal arsenal. It's definitely not the RP killer that I think a lot of people have made it out to be, but I don't think that means it's bad. I think this card is definitely the type of thing that your modern criminal is going to want to play a couple copies of, maybe only one copy of. Just having access to this effect seems really good to me. I'm especially excited to try it in Leela, because I think I have some slots in the Leela deck that I'd be willing to cut, and this could catch some RP players off guard, but it's really going to help against Sansan City Grid, and it's going to help against PE, which is definitely one of the scariest matchups. Next up is a new criminal console. This is called Forger. It's 1 to install, 1 influence. It gives you +1 link, and it has trash to avoid or remove a tag, and it's limit 1 per player as the consoles are. This is pretty sweet, especially for Geist, because you're going to get that extra link that you need to meet the cloud requirements. That's pretty cool, and just having link on consoles is something that we generally haven't had. I think only Toolbox does it. Now, the avoiding a tag thing, that's pretty cool. We were already able to do that with certain other effects. I think that's okay, but it's not really that strong. A lot of people are tagging you with mid-season replacements nowadays, so being able to avoid or remove 1 tag is probably not going to save your life against your average butcher shop, or even a lot of the modern-day Wayland decks that are more focused on playing like mid-season instead of SEA Source. Now, if they are playing SEA Source, this card's really hot against that. It's also cheap to install. Now, one thing to point out is that it doesn't give you an MU. A lot of times you're counting on that console to give you the MU. That won't necessarily be a big problem though if you're playing the Cloud Breakers, since once you have 2 link, which is just having this in play and starting with a link, then you're not going to have any memory requirements for any of your Cloud Breakers. So this card definitely seems like the console you would play in the Geist deck, and I think it could maybe see a little bit of play in some other decks. But the fact that it's going to conflict with things like Desperado is probably going to leave it out of your average criminal deck. Next up is the third of the new Cloudbreaker suite, and that's Shiv. This is 0 to install, 1 MU, it's 0 strength, and it's 2 influence. It's an Icebreaker Killer Cloud, and it has the 2 link, doesn't count as memory, that's the cloud part. Shiv has +1 strength for each installed Icebreaker, and then it has trash, break up to 3 Century subroutines. I've talked pretty extensively how I think this is going to be used in the Geist deck, so I don't really want to go a whole lot more into that. I want to talk about this card a little bit outside of that context. Objectively, I think this is the strongest of this suite, just because Sentries tend to fit this breaker a little bit better than the barriers or code gates fit the other ones. Generally, Sentries don't have a ton of strength, and one of the things that's really strong about a lot of Sentries is that they have multiple subroutines. So you're going to more often be able to get the 3 subroutine thing out of this. It seems pretty conceivable to me that your average criminal deck could play this and be able to get some sort of, like breaking Saruji or something like that, getting some sort of real effect out of this. This does really conflict with Fairy, though. So I think if you were going to play a card like this in a deck that isn't Geist, you'd probably want to consider Fairy instead, because I think Fairy is just objectively a stronger one-shot Sentry breaker. This is probably only going to see play in the Geist deck, but I do think that this is overall the best of its suite, just because of the context of Sentries. Next up, we have a new resource for criminals. That's Gang Sign. It's 1 to install, 3 influence, and it's virtual. Whenever the corpse scores an agenda, access 1 card from HQ. This is an interesting effect. I'm not convinced that it's really that great, but I think it's the type of card that I'd like to play with a little bit before I totally dismiss it. It's hard to say how often the corpse scoring an agenda is going to be in a situation where they have other agendas or even cards that you would really want to trash in their hand. It seems to me like that's probably going to be the primary use for this, is when they score an agenda, you get to access a card, and hopefully you hit like Jackson or just some type of card that you would want to be able to trash. I do think that this has some interesting synergy with like HQ interface or stuff like that. That would let you access multiple cards. So if you were already considering playing HQ interface, maybe in like a supplier-oriented deck, this card could have a lot more potential there. If you got to access multiple cards when they scored, that's definitely going to increase the odds that you'd hit an agenda or some relevant card. This is a cool tool, and I like having new interesting things like this, especially that trigger off of the corpse scoring. I just don't know if accessing HQ is really an effect that you're going to be able to get a lot of value out of. Obviously, accessing cards is good, but I think with like RP, typically it's going to be the case that they're scoring the only agenda that they have. They're going to flush agendas really rapidly, and if they have Nisei Mark II, which is their only easy to steal agenda, they're going to go try to score that. So likely their easiest to steal agenda is going to be the thing that's triggering this ability. I'd see this as being a little bit better against something like NEH, because I think it's a lot more common for them to have more than one agenda when they go to score one. Obviously, the biggest downside with this is that they're going to have played an agenda as the one that they scored to trigger this. So that's going to decrease the chance of them having agendas in their hand since they just scored one. I could see this potentially working out okay, but my inclination is that this is probably not going to make the cut in most decks unless you're playing something like HQ Interface to get more value out of it. Next up, we have another resource for Criminal. This is Muertos Gang Member. It's 0 to install, 2 influence, it's a connection. When you install Muertos Gang Member, the corp must de-res a card. And when it's uninstalled, the corp may res a card ignoring the res cost. Then it just has trash, draw a card. Well, if nothing else, this card is really interesting. This first, I want to mention that this has the trash ability, so this is potentially another option for Geist. I don't know how much you're really going to want to play this in that deck, but it is an option. Now, the big weakness of this card is that the Corp gets to choose which card to de-res. So you're going to have to play this at a time where they don't have, like Quandary resed or something like that. Because if they have some really easy to res card resed, it's going to make this card a lot less valuable. Now, the uninstall thing seems like a little easier for you to mitigate. You could definitely trash to draw a card in a situation where they've already resed most of their good stuff, or you anticipate that all of their most expensive things are res, or something like that. I feel like there's a lot of control, especially since you can use this as a paid ability. I think you're going to be able to pretty easily mitigate the fact that the Corp's going to get to res a card ignoring the res cost. I think you'd pretty easily be able to have them de-res something, somehow force them to res it, and then be able to pop this thing. Outside of Geist, where this is going to be a double draw, I could potentially see this being good in a really explosive and aggressive criminal deck. Might make sense in something like Leela. Early game, you could run R&D, play this, and then, they potentially de-res the thing they just resed on R&D. That lets you get into R&D. Maybe now you're seeing agendas. Maybe now you're bouncing HQ ice. Maybe now you're siphoning them. There's a lot of maybes in that equation, but I do think that this card is really decent in early situations where you're trying to be really aggressive. So I could see some really aggressive criminals trying this thing out instead of something like Emergency Shutdown. Seems like you're really not going to want to play both of those cards, and Shutdown's usually a lot better later in the game or in the mid game, whereas this thing could potentially be a bomb in the early game, especially if you're able to land something like Siphon. Next up, we have a new icebreaker, Foreshaper. This is Chameleon. It's 2 to install, 1 MU, 3 influence, and it starts with 3 strength. When you install Chameleon, name Sentry Codegator Barrier. Add Chameleon to your grip when your turn ends. And then it just has credit, break a subroutine of the name type. This thing isn't immediately blowing my mind, but I do think that it does some cool stuff, especially with things that haven't really seen a lot of play. The example I can immediately think of is Autoscriptor. I don't think that card's really very good, but with Chameleon, it's definitely a lot cooler. You get that click back. You could potentially even get more click value out of playing Chameleon if you were playing it in a Haley deck. Maybe some potential with that sort of rig would be the LLDS processor. I think that card's generally pretty terrible, but if you're using Chameleon as one of your primary ways to break ice, it could be really nice to have it come into play with 4, 5, or 6 strength, and you can definitely have multiple of the LLDS processors in play to stack up the bonuses you would get from them. Maybe if you want to go all the way with this sort of stuff, Replicator could make sense in that kind of deck. I don't know, it just seems like you're going to have to play a lot of bad cards to make Chameleon work, but I do think that Chameleon could do some interesting things to bring cards that we haven't really used into playability, and I think it's all around a pretty decent icebreaker just because it's cheap to install, starts with 3 strength. It's going to get you past all of the cheap and the run stuff you'd run into early in the game, and that alone is pretty decent. The last runner card in the pack should get all of you Timmy players excited. This is Hyperdriver. It's 1 to install, 3 MU, and it's 3 influence as well. It's a program. When your turn begins, you may remove Hyperdriver from the game and gain 3 clicks. Well, the first thing to point out is that this is the first 3 MU card, and I think this card is going to be massively predicated on having a way to deal with the MU problem, but I also think it's worth talking about that you need to have something good to do with those clicks. Now, I know that clicks are good and having more of them is good, but whether or not you're going to want to deal with a clunky 3MU program that's a one-shot, and you're going to have to fire it at the beginning of your turn, it's kind of awkward to use, whether you're going to want to jump through all those hoops just to like draw more cards or click for more credits or even make more runs, I think maybe you're not, especially since we've already got a lot of better ways to do those kind of things in our faction. If you're just going to draw 3 cards, you should play Diesel and not this thing. The best thing I can come up with making additional runs is something like Quest Completed or Notoriety. So that's going to make you want to play programs or resources or things like that have some sort of powerful click effects. An easy example in faction would be Magnum Opus. If you have a Magnum Opus based deck anyway, this card could potentially be pretty strong because you're going to get that 6 extra burst credits that might make you able to use Magnum Opus a bunch of times and then also make a powerful run instead of having to do that over 2 separate turns. It's also really strong with effects like Sneak Door Beta or Keyhole or maybe Data Leak Reversal. Things where you have some sort of clickability attached to your card, and it's a lot better if you can spam it a bunch of times. So how are we going to deal with the MU problem? I can come up with a couple answers to that. The first is Leprechaun. This is a card that's been inching towards playability over the last few releases, as there are more and more 2 and now 3 MU programs that you want to include in your deck. Something like Leprechaun gets a lot more value than just like a memory chip would. And I've already just detailed a bunch of 2 MU programs that combine well with this card, so it seems like maybe Leprechaun could fit into this whole mix. I'd also point to one of my favorite runners and decks, Chaos Theory, as a solution to maybe some of the MU problems here. You can have both a Magnum Opus and this in play, and that definitely seems relevant. You can also put this on Personal Workshop and let it sit there for a little bit if you're taking down a different program. That's pretty easy to do in Chaos Theory because you generally have a million billion things that you're putting on Personal Workshop. So I could see this potentially being pretty good in like a Chaos Theory Stim Shop build. Maybe also Haley could deal with this, because if you're playing like Leprechaun, a bunch of those 2 MU programs, and this, you could capitalize on her ability and you're just going to be able to spam out a bunch of programs. Whether or not this card ends up being good, it's certainly cool, it's really powerful, and I really like this sort of effect in the game. I don't see it being extremely good, but I definitely think that there could be a competitive deck that could take advantage of this card and do some really cool stuff with it. That's going to do it for part 1 of my The Underway review. This pack has a lot of cool, specialized cards that aren't going to see a lot of play, especially the Geist stuff is really all going to just fit together. I don't see you really wanting to play that stuff outside of that deck. But I really like that we're getting these packages of cards all in one pack. I really like the idea that the designers put cards that work together in a pack to make it easier for new players later on to buy just the pack that does the stuff that they want to do, and they don't necessarily have to buy a million packs spread out. Thanks for watching, and make sure you tune in to part 2 of the review, where I'm going to be looking at the corporation cards. If you like this video, press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you over in part 2.